You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, a Star Trek The Next Generation podcast exploring the series from all 7 seasons, exploring the stories, the characters, and some of the lessons therein. This show is hosted by myself, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward, for the benefit of my son, Ben the Bear, and Jake's grandson. Of course, we know there are so many Star Trek fans out there. We're releasing these on YouTube for free. How are you doing today, Jake?
I'm good, Jay, and you?
I'm doing fine.
You good?
Yeah, I'm pretty good. I think we have a pretty good show today with a pretty good episode lined up. So today we're looking at Star Trek The Next Generation 11001001, Season 1, Episode 14, which debuted on February 1st, 1988. This is actually a pretty famous episode because it actually drew 10 million people when it first debuted on syndication.
Was there any explanation as to why it was so well received?
No, the show was just kind of building up in terms of an audience. One thing that I think a lot of people don't realize about Star Trek early on is that this show was pretty famous, especially in places like Germany and Canada, where it drew huge numbers. Um, People were not expecting this to be as popular as it was out of the gates. Especially a lot of the people at not Warner Brothers, CBS. A lot of people were at this point kind of really surprised at the success the show's having. And like, just to let people know, in 1988 it draws a 10.7 on the Nielsen. So for people just to understand, the Nielsen is a company that issues boxes that go to television viewers all over the country, and some of us are randomly assigned a box that's hooked to our television. And what the Nielsen box does is that it records what you look at and how long you're looking at something on TV. So if you're watching CBS for 3 hours, it records that you've been watching CBS for 3 hours, and then all of a sudden, let's say you switch over to TNT for 30 minutes to watch the news or something like that. It records that too. So on this date, Nielsen records a 10.7. That means one person on every box was watching that day. So 10 million boxes were tuned in to Star Trek. So that's a pretty big number. I just wanted to say that just as we get into this episode, because as far as episodes go, I think it's really well put together, and it has, I think, a lot of us to talk about kind of on two different ends. But just to get started, Dad, what did you think of the episode?
I found it very entertaining. The binars were certainly interesting because, being gender neutral, that's one thing we can talk about that's contemporaneous with, things happening in society today. And the other thing is, it really, I'm sure we'll get into details of this. It talks about, it really is good science fiction in terms of talking about the future, in terms of how we weren't so tied into computers back in 1988, 89, whenever, but we've really become tied into computers now.
I really wanted to talk to you about that. So yeah, That's definitely.
And there was a little hint about how the way the binars enhanced the computer, particularly in relationship to the operation of the holodeck, that they were reading the subconscious. That was prophetic in terms of the way that Google, Facebook, social media read what our interests are.
Absolutely. I didn't even
Today.
think about it in that
Yeah.
sense. Yeah.
And
because I think
and
there's a lot to talk about when it comes to Minuet in general.
yeah, and then the other thing that was interesting is that when you know one of the basic things of the story, once we figure out what the binars did to the computer and so forth, is that there was a stellar explosion with a big EMP burst
Mm-hmm.
that wiped out their computers, and these beings are so tied into their computers they couldn't function. So we'll get into the story as to why they actually had to steal the Enterprise and use it to reboot their computer system. And I, just from a physics standpoint, I don't know if a star explodes. It would probably create a big EMP pulse, but I don't know whether actually that could happen in terms of the EMP being so strong that it could, wipe out a computer system on a planet. I kind of looked that up and I'm not sure, but it is interesting because, there is such thing as a gamma ray burst from, I think, a quasar, that if it just aimed toward Earth, we would be fried in about 10 seconds. We would be all gone.
Oh yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah, I was looking up kind of the physics of it too, and I think so from what I understand, a EMP burst, like it's an electromagnetic pulse that's released during lightning strikes or during the detonation of a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, right.
So it didn't. So if the Binars if their planet was struck by an EMP, let's just deal with this now since we're here.
Sure.
So if the Binars planet is struck by a stellar EMP, I don't take that to be something like a solar flare, because there's worry that solar flares our sun
Right.
can like cause EMP bursts and knock out satellite systems and cellular networks.
Well, that's what it could have been. That's what it actually could have been. Now I think of it.
But I also think of in the future of a lot of science fiction features electromagnetic weaponry, especially in terms of like charges and bombs in the future. So there could be a future where there was a part of me that was like, well, what if someone attacked the Binars?
Well, now that I think of it, I think if we had a really, really strong solar flare, it would be similar to a directed gamma radiation pulse from a quasar, and that it really, if it was strong enough, it could just fry all of our electrical appliances and computers on the Earth, and we'd all of a sudden be back to the 14th century.
Oh, so I was looking for there is something called like a Carrington event, which there was the Carrington event, which was a powerful geomagnetic storm on September 1st through the 2nd, 1859, when a solar coronal mass ejection hit Earth's magnetosphere and induced the largest geomagnetic storm on record. The associated white flare in the solar photosphere was observed and recorded by British astronomers Richard Carrington and Richard Hodgson. The storm caused a strong auroral display and wreaked havoc with telegraph systems. So, the sun can eject a mass that hits us and causes something like that.
Right.
So maybe that is what happened to
I
the
think that's what it
Binars,
is.
like their nearby star. Because, one thing that I don't think gets kind of covered in Star Trek very well, we have these M class or Manchara class planets, Manchara being the term we get from the Vulcans.
Vulcans, yes.
For, a planet that can sustain life like us. Or when I say us, because we use the term to sustain human life, but I think Vulcans at this point would probably look at us similar to them and be like, well, if the humans need to breathe air, we need to breathe air, so it might as well be us too.
Mm-hmm.
That's logic. um, but they've never really kind of established what kind of stars these planets surround. Like, are all these M-class planets surrounding the same kind of star? Because I posted a video a few weeks ago, and I'll link it in the description below. But what would Earth's atmosphere and skyline look like if we orbited different stars? And I'm just kind of curious about the stars that these planets orbit. Like, where is Binus in terms of the kind of star that it's orbiting?
Yeah, I've seen it's on YouTube or something like that where it shows we were if we were close to a star the same distance we were, say, from Betelgeuse or our sun. Of course,
Hmm.
we probably couldn't exist, but it would take up the whole sky and so forth. And the other interesting thing about that is if you remember the movie that's the sequel to 2001, 2010,
Oh yeah,
where they go to Saturn and they are trying to see what's going on in Europa, and
right.
they have the star, or uh, is it Saturn or Jupiter? I can't remember which. It's Saturn, I think.
Yeah, Saturn's the one with Europa.
Yeah, so it condenses and it bursts into a star, and then all of the moons of Saturn become habitable. So that's very interesting. I always thought about that in terms of,
Oh, Europa
well,
is one of the four Galilean moons orbiting Jupiter.
Jupiter.
Sorry.
It was
Yeah.
Jupiter that contracted and turned into a star, and I always think about, well, how strong was that star, and what was I mean, it's not 93 million miles like the distance from our sun to the Earth. It was a much shorter distance. So, what was the size of that star, the strength of it, so that it didn't put too much radiation onto these planets that the the Europeans basically were giving to us and say, look, leave us alone, but you can have all of these new worlds to live on.
Right. Huh.
So that is an interesting point about the stars. Yeah.
Yeah. You got me there. I have to think about that one a little bit. I've been watching a lot of The Expanse lately, so like it's dealing with the idea. It's actually interesting. We're watching the Binar episode because kind of deviating from stars, like solar objects
Uh-huh.
are kind of an interesting idea of something that comes outside of our solar system
Right.
and visit, and like the definition of what is alien,
Right.
because in the show they're dealing with this thing that's called a proto molecule, and they don't really know what it is. They know it's dangerous to like biologic human life, just because like it will get us and infect us and kill us immediately, but apparently it's collecting information when it does that
Hmm.
to us. So it's somehow a computer interface too. But anyway, speaking of interfaces, so the crew of the Enterprise D has come into they've come into Starbase 76 for repairs and upgrades, especially to the holodeck, which according to Picard, although the ship has performed well, there are problems to the holodeck. They aren't very clear about what those
No,
are,
they aren't. Correct. Yeah.
but when they get so the actual starbase that they use is from uh space dock from Star Trek 3, the search for Spock. So people recognizing the starbase on the show will have seen it before in the films. This is actually, I think, to my knowledge, uh, maybe one of two times we've actually seen the Enterprise stop at like a starbase, and we actually see them go into the starbase and interact with the people there. Um, I have to say, a pretty impressive structure if we have built these kind of things into the future.
Mm-hmm.
And it says something that we have been able to build something that immense in space. Have you seen Star Trek Beyond, Dad? The third
Yeah.
Chris.
Yes.
So, kind of deviating from Next Generation here. I recently got to watch Star Trek Beyond again, and Ben watched it with me. But there is a starbase that's kind of out on the frontier in that movie, Yorktown,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a very immense starbase
Mm-hmm.
in that movie as well. That seems to have excess, I think, of more than 1 million people on it.
Right.
Um,
Right.
just the engineering feat of these kind of facilities and bases out in space. We've talked about kind of the immensity of having a ship of 1,000 people, where it's not just military personnel or diplomatic personnel, but it's also like families and civilians. I have to imagine the typical day to day and the complexity of someone running a starbase is very, very different for the rest of, well, from the rest of everyone else in Starfleet.
Mm-hmm.
Even though I'm stumbling over my words a little bit, just
Well,
imagine if there's suddenly a hole in the dome.
it gets back to the um, this episode that's talks about computers and you know so much as that if you had
Hmm.
a starbase of that size, either the one that's demonstrated here in this Next Generation episode or in Star Trek Beyond, as you say, you'd have to have a lot of computerized control just to maintain something so large.
Oh yeah. Well, you made a previous point on an episode about some of the current challenges they're having right now in our current space technology, especially as it applies to the International Space Station when it comes to air filtration, when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
mold, and
Mm-hmm.
really handling kind of their water cycle.
Mm-hmm.
I, I can only imagine the sheer energy consumption and utilization of technology that would have to take place just to make sure that that thing has fresh water and it doesn't smell bad all the time,
Mm-hmm.
especially with that many people on
Mm-hmm.
board. Also, medical facilities. I'm very curious to see what a hospital in the future looks like, because we have kind of a view of a running hospital on board the Enterprise at all times, the sick bay. So we can see a hospital kind of real time in the future, but what do you think a hospital would look like on a star base in terms of, if this is a city, or, in some ways, in a previous episode, what's the one where it's the episode where they dealt with God? Trying to remember the name of it off the top of my head. Haven?
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, Justice, right. It was Justice.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in Justice they bring up the one of the representatives, and she gets up there and she's like, "This is a city."
Oh right.
So, if the Enterprise is a city, what would a starbase be analogous to? I guess several cities, maybe several mega cities. It it just kind of begs to question, what is the actual scale of some of the technology of the future and our ability? Because by all means, a star base, I think, is kind of a miraculous thing.
Well, the biggest challenge might be to just to get all of that material into space.
Well, one thing that they bring up on Voyager a lot in some of the few episodes I've been watching recently is that if they need to create a new part, they kind of replicate it.
Mhm.
And one thing that would be interesting to see in maybe a future Star Trek episode is how this replication technology works when it comes to actual construction. Because do they have like, we're still at the cusp of 3D printing
Mhm.
here in 2021,
Mhm.
but in the future, it wouldn't surprise me if they have like massive sized industrial replicators that they basically shoot off into space and you replicate the parts you need out there with like a team of people that bolt things together.
Yeah, but you still have to have a raw material base to,
That's
um,
probably where the bulkheads for things like ships come in and everything. Like you would
mhm, mhm.
you would probably still have to have like um lines of freighters running like they have
Right.
in Enterprise, because they have
Sure.
that episode where Mayweather goes back home to his family and they're
Yes.
running warp freighters
Yes,
at like
exactly.
warp 2.
Yeah. Warp one. Yeah. Below warp two. Exactly.
Um so when they get there, one of the things that is going to happen is that the Binars are going to come on board and they are going to upgrade the Enterprise systems, including the holodeck. And immediately, it's kind of known that the Binars are somewhat famous, um, at least to the crew of the Enterprise. Both Riker and Picard make note that their reputation somewhat precedes them, and the Binars have also noted that they've made improvements already to the computers of other several ships, and that this is somewhat a well-known thing among Starfleet personnel, at least, that you're going to show up to Starbase 76 and they're going to be there to improve your computer system. Touching for a second on the gender neutral nature of the Binars, you noted at the beginning of the episode we're living in a time where the discussion of gender, as we discussed in the previous episode, really is
Mhm.
kind of being taken and reconstructed to fit um, a more multivariate, a more inclusive prism than the original binary of just simple male versus female that it had previously been, um, arguably since antiquity. But here we have two we have two individuals. I almost called them creatures. I don't want to do that. We have two individuals who clearly are not male or female, and there's a distinction made that they are neither, but they are somehow two interlinked pairs
They're
of
pairs, correct. Yeah.
of I guess interjoined consciousnesses
Mhm.
that work in tandem while also being connected to a greater consciousness back on Binar, which is their home world,
Mhm.
which is the which is the large computer we will run into later in the episode. Um, I think that there is some interesting conversation here, not only when it comes to gender, but also maybe the future of technology. Do you know what Neuralink is when I mention it, Dad?
Not exactly. No.
So, Neuralink is something that Elon Musk is researching right now. And essentially, it is a neural interface with a computer system that he wants to install into a human brain. Um, this is and as he argues, this is the beginning of cybernetics for him.
Mhm.
Our ability to essentially what he would want us to do is be able to interface with our own internal. Um, I guess it would be a general processor that would be installed along with some sort of interface, which there hasn't been any real discussion from Musk in terms of like what that would actually look like. Would it be something that projects onto your eye? Would it be something that you have to read in terms of monitor on your hand or some sort of subdermal attachment. Um, he hasn't really discussed that, but this is a very serious project that he's putting a lot of money into. And I think one thing that is interesting about the gender conversation here is that when you have several minds that are interlinked and then you have a function or you have a functional pair that is interlinked, it seems that in this case the question of gender is something that is neither male or female and not even androgynous. It's something neutralized. Like the binars have evolved themselves from both being connected to this greater mind on binus, but also being interconnected in pairs to, I guess, not needing gender at all.
I mean, they seem to be almost, we don't know how they, what their lifespan is. We don't know how they reproduce, but, when you look at them and they're so gender neutral, it's like any implication of a sexual nature doesn't even come up with them. And I was just, thinking about,
They're a little childlike.
in some ways, I'm thinking about how with their connection to the computer and being part of a larger neural network, to use that term. This comes up again when the Borg show up.
Mm-hmm.
And, and it's interesting. There are, it's very rare that you see female Borg.
Well, you
I mean,
start getting
the only female Borg I can recall is the Queen Borg.
that in 7 of 9 from Voyager.
Oh, 7 and 9, correct. Yes. Yeah.
And do you know what? It's interesting that you bring up those two because they were controversial when they were brought out because of how the Borg had been presented to us. The Borg Queen was explainable in Star Trek First Contact because you needed an actress to interact with Data versus having Brett Spiner stand in a room talking to a voice off camera.
Right.
That'd get pretty boring pretty quick. So having an actress there, I forget her name, but she's fantastic.
She was very good. Yes.
But having an actress there to interact with worked out. Jerry Ryan of 7 and 9 was controversial in several areas because it was basically known that she was brought on as titillation, as an attractant. They wanted to
Alice Krieg.
Alice Krieg, exactly. Thank you.
Yeah.
Alice
You're
Krieg's great.
Yes.
And so is Jerry Ryan, but Jerry Ryan was brought on by Rick Berman as a way to draw kind of horny young male fans. So there was
Right.
some controversy there.
And yeah, and for the benefit of, was it Ensign or Lieutenant Kim?
There was talk of that for a while, but then they didn't.
Yeah.
But poor Harry Kim. Harry Kim never got laid.
Harry Kim. That's right.
Unlike Riker,
Yeah,
who's going to get
right.
who tries to
Yes.
get laid every episode.
Right. Exactly.
And probably succeeds.
Right.
But I think the question of kind of gender being neutralized by a piece of technological innovation and an entire system built around it is a very interesting concept that holds maybe possible futures here. One thing that I'm very curious about when it comes to our future as a species is that at some point we're going to start integrating cybernetics into our biological forms, our skeletal systems, our muscular systems, even maybe our neurological systems. I think there's a lot of benefit that can come about from that. But mentioning, as you said earlier on, the pervasive effects of things like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and Google and Amazon and Apple, as well. And this is going to jump right into the holodeck and Minuet, um, I think that there is a real question about how how do these technologies actually affect us on an evolutionary level when it comes to perception? Because I was mentioning earlier on, like, we're talking about Elon. I was talking about Elon Musk and his research in the Neuralink. Um, what happens when you actually do have a computer that's embedded now into your brain and you have an interface on all day? It's one thing for us, for you, for those at home not watching this on camera. Dad and I do this with a camera so we can see each other. I'm holding up my
Mhm.
smartphone right now. By all rights, this has become part of our evolution. This smartphone, we carry it with us
I've
everywhere
read
we
some
go. Yeah,
I've read some papers, some articles that have basically said that. Yes.
but we're by touching the screen, I'm dealing with an interface all day,
Hmm.
and it really has changed us. What happens when that interface is in your brain, on your eye, on all the time? Um, what is that? What cognitive effect is that going to have on us? In a real sense of how we organize society, how we organize ourselves, really in terms of what will it mean if when we are connected to a greater network, what will it mean to be human by then?
My guess is that there are scientists, either in pure academics or in commercial company corporate research, that we just mentioned that there's some articles and some scientific, probably peer-reviewed papers that have been written about this, and the general public probably does not understand where this could go, the intended and or unintended consequences of the fact that we've already crossed the line where we're so involved with our smart technology right now, it has basically become part of us. That line
Yes.
has been crossed.
Oh yeah.
And I'm sure, again, what I'm saying is there are people studying that from a purely scientific basis, but there are others that are studying that from a commercial perspective too, which again can be both good and bad.
Well, one thing that
Which again is one things that um, when Wesley being Wesley Crusher is very curious. He's talking to the Binars. He says something to the effect that, well, how can you be so tied into the computers? And he thinks that's great. And the Binars say back to him that um, there are disadvantages also, but those disadvantages aren't specifically discussed.
true. Well, I think that there is probably, and there's definitely a note of anxieties um, demonstrated by the Binars throughout the entire episode, from the moment that they meet Riker and Picard to the moment where they take over the ship. Um,
Mm-hmm.
there is I have to imagine that there is a very existential conversation going on among them as they're going through this episode that we don't see going on in the background. Because,
Mm-hmm.
like you said, they're being confronted right now by the biggest disadvantage of all. Like, they they're being confronted by the fact that they are so tied into one system that once that system is threatened, they have to take um, extreme severe actions like stealing the ship of one of their you know main allies without even asking,
Mm-hmm.
which they
Mm-hmm.
really could have done. And the likelihood of I know they said they didn't want to chance the idea of the being told no, but they wouldn't have been
Their
told
their
no.
their binary thinking was very logical.
Well,
They knew that Federation would say either yes or no, and they didn't want to take the chance that they would say no.
But
But
you know,
getting back to this point, the one thing is when we talk about being plugged into our smartphones, and that's a time to social media and so forth. There's that one comment um, when Picard goes into the holodeck with Riker, and they're sitting there
mhm,
talking to Minuet, and he makes a comment. The holodeck is plugged, seems to have plugged into our subconscious, and that that you know Picard is stating that because that's obviously what's happened. Why the holodeck is reading Riker's thoughts and desires and then projecting this companion, this female companion for him. But that actually ends up being the way the Binars actually plan that,
mhm.
because that enhancement is how they manipulated the Enterprise. They drew in Riker into the holodeck. Um, um, Picard's on the holodeck. I wonder if the Binars, I guess they actually planned the whole engineering accident because they knew that
Oh,
they
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 planned
thought
all of
through
it.
this, and that they planned it all so that the starship, that the Enterprise would have to leave the space dock and so forth, and then they could take control and take it to their planet and
Yeah.
so on.
Well, I think the interesting thing about luring Riker onto the holodeck and using Minuet is that there's two things going on here. First, the Binars are downloading basically their entire civilization's data core into the Enterprise because it's kind of understood, and it's kind of hinted at that they were on other ships, improving other ships, kind of looking for one that had a big enough memory bank in it, essentially, that they could take it to
Mhm.
take it back to Binus and fix everything that happened with the EMP. But there's two things.
They
So
needed a big, they needed a very, very, very large hard drive. Yes.
exactly, they couldn't just go to Target and get an external. Um,
No, that's right.
Ben's gonna listen to that joke one day, and he's gonna be like, "What are they talking about?" Because we won't have external hard drives anymore. Just watch. Um,
I'm sure. Yes.
but there's two things going on. First, they're downloading this massive amount of information from essentially the central computer of Binus into the Enterprise's memory core. At the same time, that memory core is being used to affect the holodeck to keep Riker basically at play the entire time while the Binars try to complete their mission. So there's an understanding from the Binars that once they put this information into the holodeck, they are changing the holodeck in a pretty fundamental way to do something that it's not originally designed to do, and that's to measure our subconscious. Um, that's a very I forget who I'm quoting, but that's a very neat trick to say the least.
Mhm.
And he, like, even as you note, Picard notes, like, it really has plugged into our subconscious, getting into like our real world technology. I think when, in kind of getting back to what the show's about, it's about Ben. Um, I think when he listens to this, we're going to be living in a very different world where we're having a very serious conversation about our interaction with things like smartphones, especially when it comes to children now. Um, and especially in the wake of this pandemic, where a lot of kids were forced online to take, their education classes and
Oh,
courses
yes. Right.
through Zoom, and the chaos
Mhm.
that created as this is now late March 2021. We're slowly starting to reopen the economy. Um, Maybe not in the smartest fashion, but we're also starting to put kids back into schools. Um, it's it is it is reasonable to think that we will be having a conversation about really how this technology is interceding in our child's development. Um, and it's important because, you know, it seems that in the future, as depicted in Star Trek, there are a lot of, I don't want to call them psychological traps because it doesn't seem like a lot of people are getting quote unquote trapped in them in the future. Now, they do have incidents with like Lieutenant Barclay who gets holodeck who gets addicted to the
Addicted. Yeah.
holodecks.
Right.
But, he's one out of, he's really the only one that I can think of in the entire, in all of the series that feature holodecks that get addicted to these things. So, like, that's 1 out of 100. That's pretty good. That's 1%. It seems in the future they have found a way to strike this balance where they can have these integrative technologies that can really play a real impact on the subconscious. Like, for example, Worf. Worf goes to the holodeck and practices calisthenics, where he essentially kills fantastical creatures. He even takes his son Alexander sometimes, and they kill fantastical creatures. They're killing people on the holodeck. There's a profound, and we've talked about this previously in The Big Goodbye, there's a profound psychological effect that the holodeck serves in terms of being integrative technology. What we're facing now, I think, when it comes to smartphones is, I think the problem with social media, and I was listening to an interview with this author named Cal Newport, who wrote this book called Deep Work, and he's this believer that email and social media really are killing our productivity as a society. And he wrote this book about basically how email is going to have to go through a revolution in terms of it becoming something that is productive for us as a workforce again. But at the same time, like, social media is probably going to go away because the way it works is that it's just throwing information at our brain at all times. And you can never scroll down to the end. So at some point, like, the brain just wears itself out on that. And I can tell you that I'm going through that now
I
as
can
well.
I can see that. Yeah. It just yeah.
So the point I'm getting to is that, with social media, we have this thing that I think is just wearing out on our brains because it's just information overload.
Yes.
A holodeck in the future is going to be, and maybe the next wave of social media will be like this too, is going to be much more integrative. It's going to be much more focused. It's going to be much more about you.
You're hitting something here because I've, just like what you're doing, you listen to a lot of other ideas and podcasts and things like that. And I don't tend to do that. I sign up for newsletters, e-newsletters and so
Well,
forth.
I also read a lot. Like,
Right.
most of the stuff I get through
Right.
reading.
And I've gotten to the point where I'm saying I'm not going to sign up for any more because I just don't have the time or the mental bandwidth to look at it. And it's interesting what you said about this author saying that email is making us less productive. I can, I'd have to see going back looking at before we had email and when we were transmitting information via fax. I mean, who the hell uses fax anymore? Period. And then you have, enterprise database systems so that you can, share data and that sort of thing. I think email. I don't know.
Oh, and we're moving towards a blockchain, which is basically an open
Right.
digital ledger.
Yeah, we've talked. You and I've talked about that. We haven't talked about it for a year, but you don't hear a lot about blockchain. But yeah, it's there, and I think email has made us so much more productive as opposed to writing a letter, putting in an envelope and a stamp on it, put it in the mail. It just moves a lot faster. However, the point that this gentleman makes is I think we have to look at how the operation of it, the rules of it can be streamlined so that we get maximum functionality out of it. And the same thing with the social media. It's just too damn much.
Well, let me address the Cal Newport point first, because I think one thing Cal Newport misses in this, because his book Deep Work is a really good book. It really talks about like focusing down and getting stuff done and really getting the best productivity out of you can,
Right,
and
sure.
that's important.
Yes.
Getting a real hour of work out of your day is basically his goal, and that's actually tougher than people think.
Mm-hmm.
I think what he's talking about when it comes to email is built around the idea that like we're going to be working in a typical 9 to 5, um 5 hour, 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, 40 hours of work, 40 hours a week profession for the rest of time. And one thing that I think kind of fits into fixing the email and fixing really kind of productivity across the board, and Star Trek doesn't address this, but I think it would be more likely than not. Um, you would need to have so many people running a starship. I don't think that everyone's working a 7 day work week or a 5 day work week. Maybe the captain, maybe Riker, maybe the bridge crew, and maybe like some people in engineering are working all the time. But the idea, I think one of the reasons why we as a society are so unproductive is the 5 day work week has really kind of worn itself out. You know, this technology, especially email, and you're right, email has allowed us to become more productive because we don't have to send letters or faxes anymore. But I think one thing that people are feeling is pro- productivity fatigue. Like they have to fill in something from 9 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon.
There's been some observations that with the pandemic and so many people working from home, they can't make the separation between the office or the workplace and home,
Hmm.
so that people are actually putting more time in at work. I think part of that is feeling that the fact that workers who are used to working at an office or working in a retail store or whatever, if they're working from home, they feel like they're not working, so they have this semi guilt type thing, like they have to make sure they put enough time in.
Hmm.
And we got to get past that. And I think what we're both saying is we have to look at how we can use this technology to maintain the proper life work balance. And at the same time, really, maximize productivity. But that doesn't mean we have to work 60-hour weeks.
Well, I really do think, and I forget what country's about. Oh, it's Spain. Spain's about to do a 4 hour work week.
A 4-day work week.
I'm sorry, a 4 day work week. That'd be great. A four
Yeah,
hour work
right.
week.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, they're about to do a 4 day work week. I really do think that the future is probably going to be a 3 to 4 day labor period every week, spread out among the populace for various duties. Um, you know, you're gonna have your trash men working certain things, but I think the way even the amount of capital we have now in the economy would be able to permit this on a certain level if it was distributed correctly. Uh, but we're starting to talk about different things away from the episode. Um,
Okay.
so but let's get back to the enhancement to the holodeck program in Minuet, specifically. Riker makes a point of asking how far this relationship can go with Minuet, which I take it as an implicit question of like, can we have sex? Which
that was what I construed also.
um, I think we've discussed this previously, but it's well established on Deep Space Nine that like the holosuites are being used for sexual pleasure.
Right.
It doesn't surprise me to find the officers on the Enterprise using them for potential sexual pleasure either. I think the interesting connotation here is that Riker knows that like this hologram is so different from everyone from all the others he's experienced before that he could actually find himself like potentially falling in love and forming a committed relationship with it. I think that's the bigger conversation here. And it really gets back into the conversations we've been having with previous episodes when it comes to the definition of life. Um, the question. So, when the Binars download their civilization's information into the Enterprise computer system, which the holodeck then draws from to create Minuet, um, there's an argument that the Enterprise and the Binars are through the holodeck creating a new living entity that is unique to herself. Because at the end of the episode, Riker goes back to the holodeck to try to find Minuet or recreate her. And he can't because essentially the essence of what was her, the Binar's information, is gone from the Enterprise computer because it's back on Binus. They've restored the planet and saved the entire civilization. Therefore, I think it's fair to say that like Minuet is a unique individual in this case.
Mm-hmm.
In the future, we've already discussed the potential of like, having cybernetic enhancement to our actual biological structures as human beings. If we had access to like an augmented reality somehow through that neural interface,
Mm-hmm.
because let's say we don't have like a holodeck, we have an augmented reality, and we were able to create a being like Minuet, it gets back into the question of like where is the line between what is human and what isn't? Because with Data, we've kind of discussed that like his ability to, there's various reasons why Data is human. Um, in terms of the show Star Trek Voyager with the EMH, the Emergency Holographic Program, the Emergency Medical Holographic Program, also known as the Doctor, uh, it's kind of construed very early on in the show that he's human as well because he has the ability to grow and change and alter his programming. If Minuet has the ability to, I guess, react and change according to the people she interacts with, and Riker can deem that as worthy enough to like form a committed bond to her as an actual entity, is the ability to,
I think where you're going with this is that
yeah, please step
if
in.
if the holodeck program with the capability, with the programming to create a minuet or a projection from the holodeck reading a visitor's subconscious, if that holodeck program persists, and that if Riker left the holodeck,
Mm-hmm.
but if someone else comes in and the holodeck
Oh
reads the
yes.
subconscious of that person, would Minuet exist? She probably wouldn't, because the reading of that visitor to the holodeck subconscious the projection would be different from what Riker's is. Now, you know, and we need to kind of maybe note this, because when we get into the future season, we've already talked about this. When you get a holodeck character like Professor Moriarty,
Very true.
who somehow is very self-aware, and you know that goes. I mean, he's definitely he is a human being existing in a virtual universe.
Yeah.
So we'd have to think
He's
about.
not programmed to be self-aware, where Minuet is programmed to be self-aware.
Well,
And
it's
in some
just
cases, that's the leap right there between human and not human.
right, but Moriarty has so much awareness. He wants to live out his own life.
Mm-hmm.
So it's it's a different concept, but I think that based on this series, the way Minuet um, um, is a creation of Riker's mind.
Mm-hmm.
That if Riker leaves the holodeck, then she would not really exist anymore. The program to read a visitor's subconscious would exist, but you know the chances of somebody like Minuet being projected from another mind would be, you know, astronomical.
I wonder what then says, if, and I think that you explained that very well. Thank you. But it leads to more of the question about Riker. What does it say about Riker's character that he relates to a character like Minuet so strongly? I think that there is kind of an inherent sense of loneliness and maybe a little bit of a desperation for intimacy that Riker is seeking. That he keeps falling for these characters that kind of are able to serve him in a way psychologically. I don't know if it seems like he's not finding it in the real world, and then he magically finds it with this magic woman that's created out of thin air. And I think it says something interesting about Riker, and I was wondering what you thought about that.
I think that probably if you think about it, if probably a lot of people have an idea of what their ideal lover or mate would be.
Mm-hmm.
And when you choose to marry someone or to form a short term or long term relationship with someone, you never get exactly what you want. So, this is an opportunity in this holodeck program. The way the binaries have enhanced it in this case, that Riker can, or anyone can get exactly what they want.
I wonder if he's even aware. Well, he has to be aware on some level too. Like, he has to leave the holodeck and turn off the program at some point.
Yeah, I think the fact when he says to Picard, he says, I could feel like I could, I could have a relationship with this projection.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like to him that it's real, and at the same time, he knows that it isn't.
It, one thing that we haven't talked about when it comes to holodecks, and I think maybe Minuet is the start of having this conversation. There is the potential with the holodeck especially for human beings, to go out and really explore some of the deeper darkness within us using a holodeck. And I think there's a real question about responsibility and consent when it comes to doing that hasn't really been broached. And I mentioned earlier, Worf goes out to do his calisthenics program, which is essentially killing fantastical creatures, and sometimes he brings his son along. But what is the real moral implication behind
Well,
that?
you bring up a good point, because depending on how an individual program the holodeck, it could be equivalent to taking an LSD trip or a shroom trip, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, it could be do you know what the drug halcyon is?
I know the name, but I don't remember what it does.
So Halcyon, I forget what family of drugs it falls into, but it is so powerful that people will take Halcyon and then murder their families. And off the fact that they've taken Halcyon, they're usually able to get an insanity plea off of that. Like, it's that powerful.
I just had two thoughts. Suppose you were Dante and
Oh, yeah.
you wanted to recreate the Inferno, or if you were John Milton and you wanted to do Paradise Lost, or if someone
Triazolam.
just,
That's what it is. Triazolam.
or if you wanted to just, if someone wanted to program the holodeck so that they could play out the Bible as they saw it.
Oh, you brought up Milton and you brought up Dante. Um, Going through the layers of hell in Dante would be interesting. But
Yes.
I think there would also be there's also depictions of things like rape, incest, not only just murder, but like genocide. You'd be able to like go back and witness. Like, should people be able to go back and like witness firsthand the Holocaust? Like, you could program that into the holodeck. Like, should people go back to be able to view like real time atrocities happening at the camps? Should children be able to have access to that? Because
So yeah, that gets into if you wanted to recreate a historical situation on the holodeck.
yes,
Yeah.
well, like
Mhm.
there's also the question in the holodeck that you can take off the
Safeties. Right.
the safeties. When
Right.
that happens, the holodeck can easily become a place for murder. It could become a place for self harm. Um, I think there's just so many moral implications with a holodeck, just like with a neural interface, maybe with an augmented reality in the future. That you know, we talked about social media earlier, and just how I don't think that we as human beings, and you agree with this, I think a little bit too, how cognitively we're just not ready for this, and we're not designed for it. Um,
I think that we got into it without really knowing what the rules are.
I think they. So I've done some reading into this, and the guy who actually designed kind of like the dopamine effect that you have with
Mhm.
social media, they knew what they were doing. I just don't think they knew to the effect that it was going to.
Yes, I think that the user society, we haven't figured out what the rules should be.
It's such a interesting conversation to have in terms of putting it in.
I mean,
You.
even getting into the First Amendment issues like with Twitter and Facebook,
Oh,
or what you experienced with making a comment about the colonization of Belgium and the Congo being bad, and you were
oh,
punished for it or something.
so I for this book I asked something about like what people thought some historical instances of greed, and a lot of people, including you, brought up the Belgian colonization of Congo, which featured horrible human atrocities.
Mhm.
But at one point, I kind of made a half joke that basically fuck them Belgians,
Yes,
and
right.
that's literally what I said on Facebook.
Yeah,
Fuck them Belgians, Ben.
right.
And Facebook thought that that was hate speech toward the Belgians, and like docked me. Um, I think there's another question there when it comes to the holodeck in terms of like who controls the information and how it's presented, because you brought up the freedom of information in the First Amendment. There is a I forget if it's the very last episode of Enterprise, but there is an episode of No, it is the last episode of Enterprise where Troy and Riker are going through
Oh
and
yeah, they're in the holodeck. They're revisiting. They're doing the historical thing we
but
were just talking about. Yeah.
they make a point where I think it's Troy where she says did they really look like that? And they try to make this point like the images in the holodeck look better than the actual people did.
Hmm.
Oh no, that okay, it was Voyager. There was an episode where Janeway and Tuvok go back to Tuvok's time on the Excelsior as a science officer under Captain Zulu,
Mm,
and it's
mhm,
shot during the Khitomer Accords.
mhm.
So, and they make a point like on the holodeck, like people look better than they actually did in historical record, which I think is always an important thing to note, and it's important to note here in terms of this conversation. Like, history and the historical written record, or just the historical record in general, if everything was presented via holodeck, you could really shape and alter the course of everyone's viewpoint going forward by leaving certain things in, leaving certain things out, maybe taking a scar off someone's face, maybe someone that was born with a deformity, or in a holodeck you could make it seem like FDR never had polio and never had to be in a wheelchair.
Touches on the whole deep fake technology.
Well, that is a conversation that's really fallen by the wayside in the media, but deep fakes have gotten so much better now.
Hmm.
I'll send you some things on YouTube that have come out recently that are just really startling in terms of just our ability to interpose someone else's face on someone else's body and make them say and do anything
Yeah.
is truly frightening. So I can only imagine, and we're going to have an episode later on where Riker is going to have to defend himself on the holodeck, recreating a case of murder. Um, Bless you.
The other thought I just had is that if someone engages with the holodeck, does the program store what someone programs, what they do?
Oh yeah,
And then it gets into the whole thing of like,
what
you
if you're telling
know,
the hologram your secrets?
yeah, you're telling the hologram your secret. It gets into what we talked about a couple episodes about when we're talking about genetics and what's happening with, all of the how safe is the genetic data that we're giving to ancestry.com and 23.me,
Mm-hmm.
and is that being used constructively by the National Institutes of Health, or is it being used constructively for the benefit of the Chinese Communist government?
Is there a Jake Record clone already someplace in Beijing, just waiting for the day he could take over?
That's right.
um, I like the idea of a Chinese clone Jake Record.
It's sort of a Manchurian candidate type.
Yeah, he doesn't know what he's here for. Uh, but uh, you know, I think the it's such a like I said, it's such a psychological trap in some ways, the intersection of technology when it really comes to our day-to-day lives, that I think you and I are both fans of the book Sapiens by
Mhm.
Yuval Harari.
Right.
And I think that book's really great in terms of framing something we don't think about a lot. Only 10,000 years ago were we really starting to farm and develop agricultural societies. Before that, for 100,000 years, we were hunter gatherers. We were literally running. I think about this every day, Dad. And for those listening at home, I sincerely think about this every day. I am letting you, including Ben, into the deep psyche of Jay Record right now. I'm not joking when I talk about this. At one point, our human ancestors would get up every day, and I don't think it's just men who were doing this. I think it was probably women. I think it came down to the strongest runners in the tribe. You had to get up every day, and let's say you saw a deer that was 40 yards out. you and three of your buddies. It might be your wife, it might be your brother that survived the 12 winters before with you, but you're going to run down that deer and you're going to run 20 miles to run down that deer. And that deer's heart's going to give out before your heart gives out. And then once you're done running down that deer, you have to drag that deer the 20 miles back to where the gatherers are with the children that you're trying to like guard from saber-toothed tiger every night, or the dozens of other predators that were
Well,
probably out
yeah,
there at the time.
no. It at the same time that you're trying to run down the deer,
Yeah.
you have to try to pay attention, or you may not be able to. That you might have a predator higher up on the food chain that feeds on humans that's coming after you as you're chasing the deer.
Or God forbid you're running down the deer and you break your leg and all of a sudden you have to deal with infection. You're basically done.
Yeah,
You know, I think about this every day because it's only 10,000 years ago that we actually started pushing seeds into the soil to change that.
right.
And in that time, we have gone from that, which is not, on a cosmic scale, not even a blink of an eye.
We talked about that last episode. Yeah,
But we've gone from that to smartphones and having this integrative technology that I really don't think to, you know, I think it's the argument in Sapiens that is kind of unspoken. We're not ready for most of this technology that we've built. Like as a species, as an organic biological species, we are not ready for these things that we've created.
you're saying it's happening too fast.
Well, I talk about ontology a lot in
Right,
terms of like the things we design in term redesigning us.
right.
I think
Yes,
that we performed miracles and now those miracles are in turn redesigning us, and we
yes,
don't really know what we're doing because we don't know how we did those miracles really in the first place.
right.
We just made them. We
Well,
just made them
it's
without
just
really thinking.
it's the theme of unintended consequences. We do something, we think, hey, this is great, but we really don't.
Absolutely.
We really just don't know what the what the immediate how it's changing us and how it's going to change us in the immediate future and the far future. Then,
Well, it makes me wonder that maybe in the far future, and you and I have discussed this, like there is a psychological component to the holodeck that if you're in the deep, and if you're in the depths of space and you're stuck on this vessel that's relatively constrained in terms of where you can go and do all the time, the holodeck could be a really powerful psychological tool and help in terms of helping you deal with that, but also in terms of helping you empathize and maybe have human interactions. We've seen it be used for that too.
right?
Maybe in the future we've not only evolved to maybe maybe we've gotten over the hunter gatherer brain finally to where we can actually have a holodeck and you only have that 1% like Reginald Barclay who gets addicted to it versus I think if we had a holodeck today in 2021, late March 2021, I think everyone would be addicted and we'd be on the verge of collapse of civilization if we had this thing.
Hmm.
Because just look at what social media has done to us.
Right.
I would argue social media legitimately has destroyed America. If I wouldn't say it's destroyed the world. I think other parts of the world use social media very differently than we do. But I think that social media, for the most part, has destroyed the American experiment.
I would not disagree with it at this point. If you think back of what's happened, not just in the last 4 years, but going back even when did Facebook first really get strong?
2000. I know it was around before I was in college.
So it would be early 2000s.
Yeah.
I would say that, from
2004.
well, then that's middle of the Bush administration. I would say that particularly getting into the 8 years of the Obama administration, and then the 4 years that followed, it was almost like it was really, the influence was really increasing from 2004 up to 2000, say 12, and then it exponentially rocketed the influence it had in polarizing people.
Honestly, so well, this gets into a larger
And,
question.
and, and of course, a lot of that polarization is manipulation by outside parties.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, I think one place where social, well, especially Facebook, really kind of, and Ben's going to be like, "What are they talking about, Facebook?" Because when he listens to this, Facebook might not be a thing.
Mm.
Um, Facebook as a social media platform, I think, really kind of exploded around 2008
Uh-huh.
because, you know, love him and I love him to death. I think he's one of the better presidents we've had. Barack Obama was really the first one to utilize Facebook, but in
Right.
some ways, like that was opening up Pandora's box because while he
Right.
opened up and found he was able to market his vision of hope using Facebook,
Right. Right.
I think there were also a lot of bad actors that were inside Pandora's box that when it opened,
Mm-hmm.
they saw Facebook too and they went, ha ha.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So in some ways, I think Barack Obama did a great thing by utilizing that platform, but he also opened the way to, I think greater manipulation than ever before. Because,
Mm-hmm.
it's the same thing with, speaking of my industry in terms of genre publishing, especially fantasy. Um, we in publishing really don't know our history, and I've kind of prided my career being able to make sure to really take stock of what happens in the industry from a historical perspective. None of us were ready for ebooks ever. And it's
Yeah.
funny because, like, we're talking about 2004 for Facebook. 2006 is really when the Kindle hit. Um, and ebooks really started becoming a thing. But beforehand, like, no one looked at ebooks seriously except this fantasy author named Pierce Anthony, who had the Xanth novels, which were a huge success. But he was really the only one that was going out there and being like, hey guys, this is the thing that's going to be a big deal. And when someone hits on this and finds a way to really market it in a way, like they're going to make a lot of money. Jeff Bezos and Amazon comes along and creates a device that is easy and cheap to produce,
Mm-hmm.
but is able to, sell a medium on it that revolutionizes the book industry and basically kills traditional publishing. No one was ready for it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but no one was ready for Facebook either. And, you know, I think it says something maybe about evolution that we kind of, or not even evolution, well, evolution, we kind of keep looking for these white swan moments where we can go,
Mm-hmm.
aha, here they are, here they are, here are the moments where the big change happens. Um, but it really is a bunch of black swans that kind of herald the coming of the big transformations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in some ways, this episode is a big transformation too of what the holodeck's going to be going forward. Because even though Minuet is this kind of new interactive character, like you said, we're going to have characters further on down the road that are just as interactive. If anything, a lot of the characters going forward are going to be portrayed as being as real when they're running as they would be if they were alive. So this episode is kind of an evolutionary jumping off point too in terms of how the
Mm-hmm.
show's going to handle the holodeck.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
Um, Jumping around real quick, you made a note. Is this the first use of the auto destruct option?
Uh-huh.
I think so.
I think
I
now
think
it was used in the original series, but I think this is the first time in Next Generation that it's come up.
I think they were going to use self. They talked about using the self destruct option as early as encounter at Farpoint in terms
Oh,
of
that's
like dealing
oh,
with
that's right.
Q.
Yeah,
But
right.
I
They
think this
did.
is the first time where we've seen like a formalized, the captain and the XO take out their
Mm-hmm.
keys and like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
press down a button.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I have a question for you. In terms of the fiction that you consumed, um, was auto destruct something that was common in terms of the storytelling you grew up with? Because for science fiction, you know, this is unique, really, to I think sci- I think this is really unique to Star Trek in a way. I don't see a lot of other shows using
I can't,
self destruct.
thinking about,
Did Buck Rogers use anything like that, or
well, we'd have to ask your grandfather about that because he did the Flash Gordon. He did.
oh, Flash
No,
Gordon?
I could just think of the as I said to you in a email recently. My first exposure to the idea of space travel was in 1950s. Was Rocky Jones' Space Ranger,
Right, Rocky
and no,
Jones.
I don't remember any auto destruct then. But the thing that was unique about Rocky Jones is those rockets took off vertically, and when they landed back vertically also.
I bet you Jeff Bezos is a Rocky Jones fan too.
I bet. Yeah.
Um, so, in terms of initiating self destruct, it seems very clear that the reason Picard immediately goes to it is, you have this Galaxy class starship that is the flagship. It's also the brand new piece of like technology in the fleet. I guess there's a worry that if they were captured by the Romulans or something like that, they would not want this ship to be tearing apart
Right.
for its technology.
Right.
So I understand the impetus to self destruct. The only thing that I kind of found farcical in this episode was 5 minutes. Um, do you know what they never really discuss how long it takes to really clear like a turbo lift? Like how long does it take to get from engineering to the bridge on a turbo lift?
Yeah, I thought about that. That like, why are they having some people physically running onto the starbase, and others are being beamed off? It's
Oh
like
yeah, I was
this is not a very good system to evacuate the ship. Exactly.
well, even that makes no sense whatsoever
It didn't.
either because
No.
well, I was thinking about this from what we've seen the transporters do previously.
Hmm.
The transporters can transport people from like the bridge of the Enterprise to the bridge of another ship, down to
Hmm.
engineering, back to the
Hmm.
transporter pad.
Hmm.
But you can also transport up to like 5 or 6 people in some episodes. Why isn't there kind of like an automatic transport failsafe to where, okay, everyone is, let's say you're in the middle of deep space and you have to suddenly abandon ship. Well, the failsafe goes off and it transports you, since you're in the middle of deep space, it will transport you directly to a escape pod. Like, why don't they have that failsafe in place if they can just kind of automatically transport people about? Or in that case, oh, the ship's about to explode and we're in starbase, just transport us off onto a safe place in the starbase.
My suggestion here is that if there is a time capsule put in place in San Francisco, we need to put a note in there so that when they build Starfleet, they'll say, "Oh yeah, this is a good idea. We need to consider this in terms of escape from Star Trek starships in the future."
Just
Right?
beam everyone out.
Yeah.
Um, so data painting. What did you
Yes.
think of that?
I I thought. Well, I love the comment from Riker when he says to Geordi, he says, you need to document this. A blind man teaching an android to paint. Somebody has to study that in the future.
It'll be worth a few
I
chapters.
if verse a few chapters. Um,
It's such a shit thing to say.
but it just again another sort of discussion point of discussion about how human is data,
Hmm.
that he's trying to define his creativity. And
He even has a point where he takes a creative pause to find inspiration. Um,
right,
you know, it, I think the growth of Data, and it's also a scene of him and Jordy's friendship, um,
yes,
which is constantly
yes,
growing in the first
right.
season. Um, I think Data's exploration of creativity and sometimes not being very good at it is, there's for all of Superman's powers, at the end of the day, he really is a simple Midwestern farm boy.
Uh-huh.
At For all of Data's intelligence, processing power, and superhuman strength, he's someone who can't tell poetry. He's someone who writes bad poetry and kind of paints bad paintings. He very much is us in a way, in terms of there is a normalcy about Data that I think the writers keep hitting on,
Uh-huh.
and he's so human that he doesn't realize how normal he is already,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just kind of it's at this point, because of our conversations, I now look at these as kind of just the running gag of the show.
Mm-hmm.
Like, look at this guy, look at this human trying to convince himself he's not human. um but anyway, um let's see. Oh, um let's let's end on this. So, you know there's the question of why didn't you request our help in the binars, being worried that Starfleet would say no. Logically speaking, I think this gets to the point of the show. um do you really think that anyone in Starfleet would have looked at the binars after they said, hey, our planet just suffered a catastrophic event and our civilization might be dying by the millions as we speak? Will you help us? Do you really think anyone in Starfleet would look at them and be like, fuck you, no?
Absolutely not. They would have said yes.
Like, to me, that just, it's my one thing about the show where I think they kind of throw out all the logic here.
Right.
If they
Right.
had just left this out, I think everything would have been perfect. Like, oh, we
Well,
panicked.
like we've said, they got to make the story. They got to create
Yeah.
the situation for the story. Yeah,
But,
exactly.
I have to say, for this episode, it's a really well crafted episode.
It is. It is. I was thinking that with, in preparing for the podcast tonight, going through, this is the 14th episode we've reviewed in um, season one. And it's really given me the opportunity to look at, the process that writers for a show go through. And it's really amazing and fascinating. We could do the same thing with other shows, but it's just amazing what authors, screenwriters, storytellers do to create new worlds.
Well, I think the better episodes that we're finding so far are the ones that are built around the premise of an actual story
Yes.
versus maybe kind of having an idea and building a story around it.
Mhm.
Like, I think it's very clear right now that the worst episode that we've seen is Code of Honor.
Mhm.
I think the best episode that we've seen. Um, do you have a off the top of your head so far? What do you think the best episode that we've seen? I really like the battle.
The battle, let me
That
remember
was the
what it
one
was.
where they brought the Stargazer back to Picard.
That was very good. And actually, you know, I've looked at the next one, Too Short a Season. That is actually a very
Oh
good
yeah.
story. That's a very there's not a lot of philosophical meat to it. There's some, but it's just a very
Oh
good
God, it is
story.
too. Oh, do you know what? That's going to be a great one.
It
So
is.
we'll end on that one because
Yes.
so everyone, next time we're going to be doing Too Short a Season, which is Star Trek season 1 episode 16.
Yes.
We will see you all then. Jake, thank you so much for
Thank you, Jay. It was good as always.
yeah, of course. This has been great. Thank you everyone. See you soon.